Hi everyone. We are going to walk through some examples of Punnett squares for Mendelian dominant recessive inheritance patterns. So in these slides, we'll walk through 3 examples, and then after working through the 3 examples, you will work 2 problems independently and then check your work. Genetics problem number 1. In Mendel's pea plants, there was a gene for flower position. The dominant trait is flowers that are closer to the stem are the dominant phenotype, and that is referred to as axial. And the flowers that are at the ends of the plant stems there are terminal, and that is the recessive phenotype. So we'll use the letters big A and little a to represent these 2 forms, axial being the dominant trait, terminal being the recessive trait. So when you're working with the genotypes for organisms, what you're looking at is describing the 2 alleles that they have. For example, a heterozygous genotype means having different genes were contributed to the zygote, in which case the different genes are one dominant and one recessive form. So the heterozygous genotype for flower position would be written as big A, little a. The phenotype resulting from that would be axial flowers. So phenotype is what is physically expressed based on the genotype. A plant that has the phenotype of terminal flowers, the recessive trait, would be little a, little a. They inherited 2 recessive alleles for that trait, and that is a genotype we would call homozygous recessive. Let's cross plants with those 2 genotypes. Plant number 1 was heterozygous, having axial flowers, and plant number 2, homozygous recessive, having terminal flowers. First, we need to determine the parents' genotypes. Plant 1, we can represent their heterozygous genotype as big A, little a. Plant 2, we can represent their homozygous recessive genotype as little a, little a. From there, we can determine what alleles they could pass on to their offspring via their gametes. Gametes are the eggs or sperm that are made by meiosis, and during meiosis, an individual's 2 copies of a gene separate from each other, and they are only passing on one. For plant number 1 that was heterozygous, they have 2 different alleles they could pass on. So they could pass on either a big A or a little a, meaning a dominant gene or a recessive gene. The parent that is homozygous recessive only has 2 recessive alleles, so that is what they are able to contribute. Having those gametes is important because it directs you to what size of a Punnett square you'll need to make. With a parent that can donate 2 options and a second parent that can donate 1 option, you'll need a 2x1 Punnett square. So you can draw your grid, and then the next step is to put the parent's gamete options outside of the rows and columns. So here, parent 1 is placed on top of the Punnett square. They could give either their dominant allele or their recessive allele. And parent 2 is placed on the left, and they are only able to donate a recessive allele. You fill in the inside of the boxes by combining the gametes on top and left. So this would be as though fertilization occurred between the parent's dominant allele and the parent's recessive allele, resulting in a heterozygous offspring. On the right side, we're combining 2 recessive alleles. That would be the possibility of a homozygous recessive offspring. In analyzing a Punnett square, you need to pay attention to whether you are being asked for a ratio or a probability, and whether you are looking at a genotype or a phenotype. Here we're asked what is the genotypic ratio of their offspring. So we want to look at the gene combinations, big A, little a, or 2 little a's, and the ratio at which they each occur. The way that this would be formatted is 1 heterozygous for every 1 homozygous recessive. If you were verbally reading that, you would say for every 1 heterozygous plant, there is 1 homozygous recessive plant. That's the ratio. What is the phenotypic ratio? So phenotype is physically what happens, axial flowers or terminal flowers, depending on the genotype. On the left, this heterozygous genotype will result in axial flowers, and on the right, this homozygous recessive genotype will result in terminal flowers. There's 1 of each, so this is a ratio of 1 to 1. We would read it: for every one plant with axial flowers, there is one plant with terminal flowers. What is the probability of their offspring having terminal flowers? For probability, we can express these as percentages or fractions. In this case, the phenotype terminal flowers came from this one genotype out of the two options. So probability is 1/2, 1 out of 2, or 50%. Terminal being the recessive trait, it is the result of the genotype a. That's the end of genetics problem number 1.